The red dust swirled across the barren landscape, coating everything in a fine, toxic film. Kalen pulled the tattered respirator tighter against his face, feeling the familiar sting of the abrasive particles working their way through the worn filters. His eyes, narrowed against the perpetual twilight of the scar, scanned the horizon through cracked goggles. Nothing but devastation for miles, twisted metal remnants, half-buried structures, and the occasional glint of something that might be valuable enough to justify this risky excursion. 15 years since the collapse, and the scar remained a death trap. Most scavengers lasted 3 expeditions, maybe 4. Kalen had survived 27. Not because he was particularly skilled or lucky, but because he had nowhere else to go. The military didn't want their broken soldiers back, and civilian settlements had little use for people who knew nothing but combat and survival. His detection unit gave a weak chirp, the analog needle quivering toward the northeast. Kalen frowned, adjusting the sensitivity. Energy signatures in the scar were rare, usually the dying gasps of old tech or the dangerous pulsing of unstable reactors. This one was different, faint but consistent, almost rhythmic. Against his better judgment, curiosity nudged him forward. The dome appeared after an hour's careful navigation through a maze of debris. Half collapsed and partially buried, it must have once been an impressive structure, one of the many research facilities or biomes that had populated this region before the wars. The remnants of sophisticated architecture peeked through years of accumulated dust and decay. Vegetation, mutated and strange, had claimed portions of the exterior, thriving where nothing should grow. Kalen circled cautiously, examining possible entry points and potential threats. His detector's signal grew stronger as he approached a fractured section of the dome. Weapon drawn, he slipped through the gap, immediately dropping into a defensive crouch inside. The interior was a strange contrast to the devastation outside. Though damaged and decaying, there was an eerie preservation to the space. Ambient light filtered through panels that somehow still functioned, casting everything in a pale blue glow. The air was different too, still toxic but less abrasive, allowing Kalen to slightly loosen his respirator without immediate consequences. Moving silently through what appeared to be a central atrium, Kalen followed his detector deeper into the facility. The signal led him down a corridor where roots and vines had broken through walls, creating an unsettling fusion of technology and mutated nature. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic counterpoint to his careful footsteps. The detector led him to a sealed door, its locking mechanism long dead. Kalen wedged his pry bar into the gap and leveraged his weight against it. The door gave way with a screech of protesting metal that echoed through the silent facility. Kalen froze, listening for any response to the noise. Nothing. He eased forward into what appeared to be a laboratory. Equipment lay scattered and broken across workstations. Data pads and screens, dark for years, were covered in the same fine dust that coated everything in the scar. But one corner of the room glowed faintly, drawing his attention. The detection unit now pulsed rapidly in his hand, the needle pinned to the maximum reading. Whatever he'd been tracking was here, in this room. Kalen moved cautiously toward the source of the glow, stepping over debris. It was there, in the far corner, that he first saw her. At first glance, she appeared human, a woman huddled against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. But as Kalen approached, the differences became apparent. Her skin held a subtle luminescence that mirrored the ambient light of the facility. Patterns, like circuits or veins, traced geometric paths across her exposed arms and face, pulsing with the same rhythm his detector had locked onto. Her eyes, when they snapped up to meet his, were entirely black except for pupils that seemed to swirl with points of light, like distant stars. She was injured. A gash along her side leaked a fluid that was mostly blood but had the same faint bioluminescence as her skin. One arm was clutched protectively around her midsection, the other raised defensively. The moment their eyes met, pure terror flooded her face. She pressed harder against the wall, as if trying to phase through it to escape. There was recognition in that terror, not of Kalen specifically, but of what he represented. A human. A threat. She had seen what humans could do, and she expected nothing but violence from his hands. Kalen knew that look. He'd seen it on the faces of civilians caught in war zones, on fellow soldiers cornered by enemy forces, on his own reflection during the worst of the conflicts. It was the look of someone expecting death, but too exhausted to run. Anymore, his weapon remained half-raised, professional caution warring with something else, something he'd thought burned out of him years ago. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the gun and secured it in its holster. The woman's eyes tracked the movement, confusion momentarily replacing fear. Kalen reached for his pack, movements slow and telegraphed. The woman tensed again, anticipating some new form of threat. Instead, he withdrew a canteen and a small medical kit. Keeping his distance, he placed both on the ground between them and slid them toward her with his foot. "Water," he said, his voice rough from disuse and the constant irritation of the scar's atmosphere. "And bandages, for your wound." The woman stared at the items, then back at Kalen, suspicion and disbelief warring on her face. She made no move to take them. Kalen stepped back, giving her space. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words felt foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd spoken to another person? When was the last time he'd offered help instead of calculated his own survival advantage? The woman's gaze remained fixed on him, her body still coiled with tension, but something had changed. The absolute certainty of violence had been replaced by confusion, a small crack in her defensive posture. Kalen retreated another step and turned his attention to securing their immediate surroundings, giving her privacy to decide whether to accept his offering. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant dripping water and the soft hum of whatever energy coursed through the facility and through her. Minutes passed before he heard movement. From the corner of his eye, he saw her reach tentatively for the canteen, her movements guarded as if expecting a trap. She inspected it carefully before taking a small sip, then a larger one once she deemed it safe. With similar caution, she examined the medical supplies. Neither spoke. In the blue half-light of the abandoned laboratory, two survivors of different worlds regarded each other with wary uncertainty, the distance between them more than physical. Kalen settled against the opposite wall, deliberately non-threatening, and prepared for a long night. Outside, the toxic winds of the scar howled against the dome, a reminder of the desolation waiting beyond these fractured walls. Inside, a fragile moment of non-violence existed between strangers, more precious and rare than any artifact Kalen had ever scavenged from the ruins. The silence between them held both danger and possibility. For the first time in years, Kalen felt something that resembled hope, though he wouldn't have remembered to call it that. The woman remained pressed against the wall, her eyes never leaving Kalen even as she tentatively applied antiseptic to her wound. Each movement was careful, controlled, radiating distrust. The bandages proved challenging with one hand, but she refused to show vulnerability by struggling openly. Kalen pretended not to notice, maintaining his position across the room. He busied himself checking his gear, a routine so ingrained he could perform it blindfolded. The familiar motions gave him something to focus on besides the strange woman and the questions her existence raised. Hours crept by. Outside, the perpetual storms of the scar intensified, battering the dome with increased fury. Inside, the uneasy stalemate continued. Kalen dozed fitfully, decades of combat training allowing him to rest while remaining alert to any threat. The woman didn't sleep at all. When Kalen's eyes would flutter open, he'd find her watching him, her luminous patterns pulsing slightly faster whenever their gazes met. It wasn't until the second day that the first word was spoken between them. Kalen had been investigating the laboratory, searching for anything useful or valuable. Most of the equipment was beyond salvage, but he'd found a cache of preserved ration packs in a sealed container. He placed one near the woman, maintaining their unspoken protocol of distance. "What?" The word hung in the stale air. Her voice was unexpected, melodic but slightly discordant, as if multiple tones layered over each other. Kalen turned, finding her staring at him with those strange, star-filled eyes. "Why what?" His own voice felt rusty and used. "Why help me?" She gestured to the bandages, the water, the food. "What do you want?" Such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Kalen didn't fully understand it himself. After years of looking out only for himself, of seeing other people as either threats or marks, this momentary compassion felt foreign. "I don't know," he answered honestly. She studied him, those otherworldly eyes seeming to look through his weathered exterior to something beneath. Finally, she said, "My name is Alara." "Kalen," he replied. That was the extent of their conversation for the day, but something had shifted. A door had been cracked open, just enough to let in a sliver. A possibility. As days turned into a week, their coexistence evolved into a fragile routine. They shared the space and limited resources with minimal interaction, each keeping to their territory. Kalen continued exploring the facility, gathering useful items and learning more about its purpose. Alara's wound slowly healed, her movements becoming less guarded, though her suspicion remained. Kalen observed her when she thought he wasn't looking. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin fluctuated with her emotions, brightening when she was alert, dimming when she was at rest. She had a strange affinity with the facility itself. Several times he'd found her with her hand pressed against dead terminals, the circuits in her skin pulsing in patterns that matched the inert technology. Once, briefly, a screen had flickered to life under her touch before dying again. More fascinating was her connection to the mutated plants that had invaded the dome. They seemed to respond to her presence, reaching toward her as she passed. Vines that blocked pathways would subtly shift when she approached, creating openings just wide enough to pass through. Kalen had his own secrets, though he believed them better hidden. The nightmares that plagued his sleep, causing him to wake in cold sweats, gun drawn against enemies long gone. The military insignia he kept hidden in an inner pocket, belonging to a unit that had been instrumental in creating the scar. The way he flinched when certain alarms or tones sounded in the decaying facility, muscle memory from battles he tried to forget. But privacy was an illusion in such close quarters. Just as he observed her, she watched him. Her otherworldly eyes missed nothing, cataloging his reactions, his routines, the way he checked exits and sight lines with practiced precision. Their uneasy truce might have continued indefinitely if not for the storm. 8 days into their shared captivity, the weather systems of the scar, always volatile, unleashed something unprecedented. The dome, already compromised, groaned under the assault of toxic winds carrying debris from across the wasteland. Kalen was returning from exploring a new section when the first major breach occurred. A support beam, weakened by years of exposure and neglect, finally gave way. The collapse sent a cascade of rubble through their main chamber, nearly crushing him. Dust and toxic external atmosphere rushed in, immediately burning his exposed skin. Without thinking, he shouted, "Alara!" Through the chaos, he spotted her across the chamber, pinned by falling debris. The toxic air swirled around her, but seemed to affect her less severely than it did him. Still, she struggled against a chunk of ceiling that trapped her leg, panic evident in her rapidly pulsing bioluminescence. Kalen rushed forward, pulling his respirator over his face. Together, they heaved against the debris. The effort sent pain shooting through his old war injuries, but the adrenaline pushed him through. As the weight shifted, Alara pulled free, her leg clearly injured but functional. "We need to move deeper," Kalen shouted over the howling wind. "This section isn't stable anymore." Supporting each other, they fled through the corridors as more of the outer dome gave way behind them. Alara limped but kept pace, occasionally placing her hand against the walls. Each time she did, the facility seemed to respond. Doors that should have been sealed slid open just enough for them to squeeze through. Lights flickered briefly to life, illuminating escape routes. They ended up in what appeared to be a central core of the facility, better protected from the external environment. Emergency systems, running on the last dregs of power, had sealed this section off from the breached areas. The air was clearer here, allowing Kalen to pull down his respirator and catch his breath. In the relative safety, they took stock of their injuries. Kalen had sustained cuts and chemical burns from the toxic atmosphere. Alara's leg was badly bruised, but not broken. More concerning was the way her bioluminescent patterns flickered irregularly, like a system experiencing power fluctuations. "You're hurt," she said, surprising him by being the first to acknowledge the other's condition. "I've had worse." He winced as he attempted to clean a particularly nasty gash on his arm. His field medical kit was running low on supplies. "Let me." Alara moved closer, taking the antiseptic from his hands. Kalen tensed at her proximity, years of combat instincts screaming at the vulnerability of allowing someone so close. But he remained still as she tended to his wounds with unexpected gentleness. "You fought in the wars," she said as she worked. It wasn't a question. Kalen didn't answer immediately. His unit wasn't something he discussed, especially not with strangers. But after a moment, he gave a single nod. "I recognize the signs," she continued. "The way you move, how you assess. Threats, your nightmares. You hear those." He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way physical injuries never made him feel. "Sound carries in here." Her fingers traced along a scar that predated their meeting, one of many that mapped the history of violence across his body. "You were part of it, weren't you?" The collapse, the creation of the scar, the accusation hung between them. Kalen could have denied it, but what was the point? Yes. He expected hatred, revulsion. Instead, she merely nodded and continued treating his injuries. "This facility," she said after a long silence. "Do you know what they did here?" "No." He'd been wondering about that since their first encounter. "They made me." The words were simple, but carried the weight of immeasurable suffering. They took human elements and blended them with technology and biological material they didn't understand. Dozens of attempts, hundreds of failures. Her luminous patterns dimmed, pulse slowing as if the memory itself drained her energy. "For what purpose?" Kalen asked. "Communication," she replied. They created the scar with their weapons, but couldn't survive in it to study or reclaim it. They needed intermediaries who could interface with both the technology and the new biology emerging in the wasteland. She finished bandaging his arm and moved away, creating distance between them again. In the dim emergency lighting, her own luminescence cast eerie shadows across her face. "How did you survive when the facility was abandoned?" Kalen asked. "Suspended animation chambers," intended for transport to other research sites. Her expression darkened. "I escaped during the evacuation when systems were failing. The others, my siblings, they weren't so fortunate." The revelation of what the facility had been, a place of experimentation and suffering, settled heavily between them. It explained Alara's terror upon first seeing him, her expectation of violence from human hands. It also raised uncomfortable parallels with Kalen's own past, the atrocities he'd participated in during the wars. That night, they slept in shifts, though neither truly rested. The storm continued its assault outside, but the core remained intact. Their temporary sanctuary felt both more secure and more oppressive with the weight of their shared confessions. As dawn broke, meaningless inside the sealed core, but marked by their chronometers, Kalen made a decision. "We can't stay here. Supplies are limited, and the dome's structural integrity is compromised. We need to find another shelter or risk being buried when this place finally gives way." Alara nodded, but her expression revealed concern. "The scar is dangerous for me outside this facility. The remnants of the old world. They hunt for things like me. And the atmosphere, I can tolerate it better than you, but not indefinitely." "Then we look for transportation," Kalen said. "This place must have had evacuation protocols, vehicles. If we can find something operational." The plan was optimistic at best, desperate at worst. But it gave them purpose, a reason to continue their uneasy alliance. Together, they began methodically exploring the core, searching for anything that might aid their escape. It was Alara who found the first clue. In a sealed room that responded to her touch, they discovered records, both physical and digital, of the facility's layout. Among them was reference to an emergency evacuation bay located in the deepest level. Most of it would have been used during the initial abandonment, Kalen noted, studying the schematics. But there might be something left, a shuttle, a ground transport, even parts we could salvage. Their search took on new urgency. As they ventured deeper into the facility, the environment changed. The invasion of mutated plant life decreased, replaced by sterile corridors that had remained sealed since the collapse. Equipment here was better preserved, some of it responding weakly to Alara's presence. It was in one of these deeper chambers that they found the first evidence they weren't alone. A surveillance drone, small and silent, hovered in the shadows of a corridor intersection. Its design was sleek, more advanced than the pre-collapse technology surrounding it. Kalen spotted it just in time, pulling Alara back around a corner before its scanning beam swept their position. "Security system?" Alara whispered, her luminescence dimming to near invisibility. Kalen shook his head. "Too new. Someone else is here. Recently." The implications were disturbing. The scar was largely avoided by all but the most desperate scavengers, and this facility had been hidden enough that Kalen only found it by tracking Alara's unique energy signature. For someone else to be here, they must have been specifically looking for something or someone. "They're looking for me." Alara's voice was flat with resignation. "They never stopped looking." "Who?" Kalen kept his gaze on the corridor, calculating routes and defensive positions. "The corporation that funded this facility. When I escaped, I took something valuable." She touched her chest, where the bioluminescent patterns converged in a complex nexus. "Myself. The only successful prototype. Their investment." A distant sound, metal against metal, echoed through the corridors. The drone responded, zipping away toward the noise. "We need to move," Kalen said. "Now." They altered their route, taking maintenance passages and access tunnels to avoid main corridors where drones might patrol. Alara led the way, her connection to the facility becoming increasingly valuable as they navigated its depths. Doors that would have been impassable for Kalen alone opened at her touch. Systems temporarily reactivated to provide them information or distractions for their pursuers. They weren't fast enough. As they approached a major junction that would lead them to the evacuation bay, multiple drones converged from different directions, their scanning beams crisscrossing the space ahead. Behind the machines came the sound of heavy footsteps, human pursuers. Kalen pulled Alara into a recessed doorway, assessing their options. His military training kicked in, multiple scenarios calculating in his mind. "Know them good. I can create a diversion," Alara whispered. "The facility responds to me. I can trigger systems, create false readings. Too risky. They'll know it's you. What choice do we have?" She was right, and Kalen knew it. Checking his weapon, power reserves low, but functional, he nodded. "Create chaos, but stay hidden. I'll handle any that get through." Alara placed both hands against the wall, her bioluminescent patterns accelerating to a rapid pulse. Throughout the corridor, long dormant systems suddenly sparked to life. Alarms blared, doors cycled open and closed, and environmental controls went haywire, venting steam and coolant into some passages while creating vacuum locks in others. The drones scattered, their programming forcing them to respond to multiple alerts simultaneously. From beyond, shouts of confusion echoed as the human pursuers dealt with the facility's sudden rebellion. "Now!" Kalen grabbed Alara's hand, pulling her from their hiding spot. Together, they sprinted across the junction, diving into the passage that would lead them to the evacuation bay. They almost made it. A final drone, more sophisticated than the others, dropped from a ceiling recess directly in their path. Before Kalen could raise his weapon, it emitted a high-frequency pulse that sent Alara to her knees, screaming in pain as her bioluminescent patterns flared wildly. Kalen fired, destroying the drone, but the damage was done. The pulse had served its purpose, not just attacking Alara, but signaling their location. Heavy footsteps approached rapidly from multiple directions. Dragging Alara to her feet, Kalen half-carried her the remaining distance to the evacuation bay doors. They were massive, designed to withstand the pressure differentials of emergency launches, but like everything else in the facility, they were old and degraded. "Can you open them?" Kalen asked as Alara leaned heavily against him, her patterns still fluctuating erratically from the drone's attack. She placed a trembling hand against the access panel. Nothing happened. "It's different," she gasped. "Isolated system. Security, too strong." The footsteps grew closer. Decisions narrowed to a single desperate option. "Stand back," Kalen ordered, setting Alara aside. From his pack, he retrieved his last resort. A breaching charge, illegal and expensive, save for the worst scenarios. He placed it precisely at the door's weakest point, setting the timer for minimal delay. The explosion was more controlled than Kalen expected, testament to the quality of the black market device. The doors didn't shatter, but buckled inward enough to create a gap they could squeeze through. Inside, the evacuation bay spread before them. Mostly empty, as expected, but not entirely. A single shuttle remained, its design utilitarian and pre-collapse. The kind of emergency vehicle designed to be simple enough for anyone to operate in crisis conditions. Kalen did a quick assessment as they approached. Dusty but intact. Fuel levels unknown. Life support questionable. Better odds than facing whatever came through that door after them. As they reached the shuttle, the buckled evacuation bay doors gave way entirely. 6 figures entered, 4 in advanced environmental suits with corporate insignia, 2 that moved with the jerky precision of combat drones. All armed, all focused on Alara. Prototype Epsilon, one called out, voice distorted through external speakers. "Stand down and prepare for recovery." Kalen pushed Alara toward the shuttle's entry hatch. "Get it started, any way you can. What about you?" Her eyes, those star-filled voids, widened in alarm. "I'll buy time." He checked his weapon, grimacing at the power indicator. "Maybe enough for 2, 3 shots. Go." For a moment, he thought she might refuse. Then she nodded, slipping inside the shuttle. Kalen took position, using the vehicle's bulk as cover, weapon trained on the approaching threats. "Stand aside, scavenger," the leader called. "The prototype is corporate property. Interfere and you'll be terminated." Kalen didn't bother responding. Words wouldn't matter to these people. Instead, he aimed carefully and fired, taking out one of the combat drones. Its destruction bought him credibility. They now knew he could hurt them, that he wasn't just another unarmed scavenger to be brushed aside. The corporate team split up, seeking better firing positions. Kalen tracked the nearest, waiting for a clean shot. Behind him, he heard the shuttle's systems humming to life. Alara was making progress. "Last warning," the leader called. "The prototype is damaged goods anyway. We only need the core technology, which we can salvage from its corpse just as easily." That confirmed Kalen's suspicions. They didn't want Alara alive, just the technology integrated into her body. The thought crystallized something in him, a protective instinct he'd thought lost years ago in the brutality of war. The remaining drone moved suddenly, attempting to flank his position. Kalen fired again, catching it mid-leap. The shot depleted his weapon's charge, leaving him defenseless against the 4 remaining humans. Inside the shuttle, systems continued powering up. Not fast enough. The corporate team was closing in, weapons ready. Kalen prepared himself for a final, hopeless rush. At least he could create chaos, maybe give Alara a chance to complete the launch sequence. Before he could move, the shuttle's external lights suddenly blazed to full power, blinding in the dim evacuation bay. The corporate team faltered, shielding their eyes. In that moment of distraction, the shuttle's cargo door opened behind Kalen. "Now!" Alara's voice, strange and multi-toned, called from within. Kalen didn't hesitate. He dove backward through the opening just as weapons fire erupted from the recovery team. The door sealed behind him, impacts peppering the exterior hull. Inside, Alara wasn't in the pilot's seat as expected. Instead, she stood in what appeared to be an interface chamber, Her body connected to the shuttle's systems by pulsing tendrils of light that extended from her bioluminescent patterns. Her eyes were closed in concentration, face contorted with effort. "Hang on," she warned, voice strained. The shuttle lurched, systems engaging in a sequence Kalen didn't recognize. Not the standard launch protocol he'd expected, but something more desperate and direct. Emergency overrides, forcing ancient motors into action without the usual safety procedures. The vessel shuddered violently as it broke free from long-unused docking clamps. Through the viewport, Kalen saw the corporate team scrambling back as the shuttle's engines ignited, filling the bay with superheated exhaust. Their escape was neither smooth nor elegant. The shuttle crashed through partially closed bay doors, structural integrity warnings blaring throughout the cabin. The navigation system, awakened after decades of dormancy, struggled to orient itself in a world changed by the collapse. But they were moving, accelerating away from the facility, from the corporate hunters, from their shared past. Alara remained connected to the shuttle's systems long after the immediate danger passed, her energy seemingly the only thing keeping the ancient tech functioning. When she finally disconnected, collapsing into the co-pilot's seat beside Kalen, her luminescence had dimmed to the faintest glow. "I didn't know you could do that," Kalen said, dividing his attention between the viewport and their cobbled-together sensor displays. "Neither did I," she admitted, exhaustion evident in her voice. "Not to that extent. Interface, yes, but direct control. That was new." They lapsed into silence, both processing the implications of their escape and the uncertain future ahead. The shuttle limped through the toxic atmosphere of the scar, systems regularly threatening to fail completely. Only Alara's periodic reconnection with the interface kept them airborne, each effort leaving her weaker. "We can't stay in the scar," Kalen finally said, breaking the silence. "That corporation will have tracking capabilities, and even if they don't find us immediately, the shuttle can't handle this environment long-term. Where then?" Alara's question held both hope and fear. Kalen studied the limited navigational data they had. "There's an outpost, or there used to be, at the edge of the scar. Former mining operation turned smuggler haven. If it still exists, we might find repairs, supplies. Maybe even passage further out." "Further out," Alara repeated, testing the concept. "Beyond the scar entirely. Is that what you want?" Kalen asked, realizing he hadn't considered her plans beyond immediate survival. She turned those star-filled eyes to the viewport, gazing across the devastated landscape below. "I've never known anything but the scar and the facility. I was created for this environment, to interface with its broken technology. Beyond it, I don't know what I would be." "You'd be free," Kalen said simply, "to find out." The journey to the outpost pushed the shuttle and Alara to their limits. Systems failed repeatedly, requiring her increasingly difficult interventions to restore. Their course meandered as they avoided detection, adding days to what should have been a direct flight. By the time the outpost appeared on their sensors, both shuttle and passengers were running on reserves. Kalen had rationed their limited supplies carefully, but Alara's condition concerned him more. Each interface with the shuttle drained her further, her luminescent patterns growing fainter, their pulse slower. The outpost itself had changed since Kalen's information was current. Once a rough collection of repurposed mining structures, it had evolved into a proper settlement. A protective dome, smaller but more intact than the research facilities, covered a cluster of buildings. Lights indicated habitation, and the presence of defensive systems suggested organization beyond the chaos of typical scar survivors. Approaching with caution, Kalen transmitted old identification codes, not his military credentials, but those of a registered scavenger. Whether they would be recognized or respected remained to be seen. After tense minutes with no response, permission to land came through, terse, suspicious, but not openly hostile. Better than Kalen had hoped for. As they maneuvered to the designated landing area, Alara stirred from her exhausted stupor. "Will they accept me?" she asked, gesturing to her obviously non-human features. Kalen considered lying. offering false reassurance. Instead, he opted for honesty. I don't know. This place. It attracts those who don't fit elsewhere. Mutants, deserters, corporate fugitives. But you're something else entirely. Something else entirely, she echoed, a sad smile playing across her luminescent features. The story of my existence. The landing was rougher than intended, the shuttle's systems finally giving out as they touched down. Through the viewport, Kalen could see armed figures approaching, security of some kind, their weapons ready but not aimed directly at the vessel. Stay behind me, he told Alara as they prepared to disembark. Let me do the talking. She nodded, pulling a scavenged cloak over her head to partially conceal her distinctive features. Together, they approached the shuttle's exit, uncertain what reception awaited them. The airlock cycled, exposing them to the outpost's atmosphere. Filtered and controlled, but still carrying the unmistakable metallic tang of the scar. The armed figures waited several meters away, their stance professional rather than aggressive. As Kalen and Alara emerged, one figure stepped forward. State your business and duration of stay. Repairs and supplies, Kalen answered, keeping his hands visible. Duration depends on what's available. The security team evaluated them, eyes lingering on Alara's partially concealed form. If they noticed anything unusual, they gave no immediate indication. Docking fees apply. Payment in advance. Hard currency or tradable goods only. The leader's tone was impersonal, bureaucratic. Kalen nodded, reaching slowly into his pack to retrieve a small container. Inside were components he'd scavenged from the research facility, pre-collapse tech, valuable enough to secure their immediate needs. The transaction completed, they were directed toward the settlement proper, a maze of repurposed structures, makeshift repairs, and unexpected innovations. The population was indeed diverse, just as Kalen had suggested. Humans with various mutations caused by scar exposure moved alongside individuals with crude cybernetic enhancements. Former corporate security mingled with deserters from various factions of the collapse conflicts. In this environment, Alara's differences drew curious glances but not outright hostility. Her cloak remained in place, concealing the full extent of her uniqueness, but her luminescence occasionally peeked through, catching observant eyes. They secured basic accommodations, a small room in what had once been mining crew quarters, and began assessing their options. The shuttle was beyond economical repair, as expected. Their components had purchased them temporary sanctuary, but long-term survival would require more resources or another plan entirely. Days passed as they adapted to outpost life. Kalen leveraged his scavenging experience to secure minor work, gathering information while earning enough to extend their stay. Alara remained mostly in their quarters, her energy slowly recovering now that she wasn't maintaining the shuttle systems. It was during their second week that their fragile security shattered. Kalen returned from a supply run to find their quarters ransacked. Alara was gone. On the floor lay her cloak, torn and discarded. Signs of struggle were minimal. She had either left willingly or been overwhelmed quickly and efficiently. Cold fury and something deeper, fear for another person, a sensation Kalen had thought himself incapable of after the wars, drove him through the outpost. Information was a commodity here, bought and sold like any resource. Kalen spent the last of their credits purchasing what he needed. Confirmation that a corporate extraction team had infiltrated the outpost, identified Alara, and taken her. Their destination wasn't difficult to determine. A private docking bay, a corporate shuttle. Their departure only hours ago, heading not back toward the heart of the scar, but outward, beyond its boundaries to whatever headquarters awaited. Options limited, resources depleted, Kalen did the only thing possible. He stole a ship. Not just any vessel, but a small, agile scout craft used by outpost security for perimeter checks. The theft was methodical, leveraging skills from his military days that he'd tried to forget. Security bypasses, engine overrides, rapid pre-flight calculations, all executed with cold precision. His actions would burn any goodwill he might have established at the outpost. making it another place he could never return to. It hardly mattered. The scout craft was faster than the corporate shuttle, designed for quick interceptions rather than passenger comfort. Kalen pushed its engines beyond safety parameters, following the trajectory he'd extracted from outpost records. The gap closed hour by hour as both vessels moved beyond the Scar's boundaries, into clearer skies and less toxic atmosphere. When he finally caught sight of the shuttle, it was approaching a massive structure, a corporate arcology floating at the intersection between the Scar's edge and the relatively untouched territories beyond. The monolithic facility bristled with defenses and communication arrays, a fortress of wealth and power overlooking the devastation it had helped create. Direct confrontation was suicide. Even if Kalen could somehow overcome the shuttle's defenses, the arcology would vaporize his stolen craft before he could dock. A different approach was needed. He waited, tracking the shuttle's approach and analyzing the arcology's security patterns. The corporation maintained its dominance partly through predictability, rigid protocols, precise scheduling. Vulnerabilities existed not in their technology, but in their routines. The shuttle docked at a high-security bay, likely delivering a Lara to awaiting researchers. Kalen observed the subsequent shift change among external maintenance crews, noting the precise timing and authorization procedures. A plan, desperate and unlikely, formed in his mind. He maneuvered the scout craft to a maintenance shadow, a blind spot in the arcology's sensor coverage created by its own massive communication array. There, he donned his Scar survival gear, the respirator and protective clothing that had saved him countless times in the toxic wasteland. With limited life support and a magnetic grapple liberated from the scout craft's emergency kit, he opened the airlock and launched himself toward the hulking structure. The transit was harrowing, a gap of open space between his stolen vessel and the arcology's maintenance access hatch. Each second exposed meant another opportunity for detection. Kalen focused on the rhythm of his breathing, counting the seconds until he reached his target. The access hatch yielded to maintenance override codes he'd observed during his surveillance. Inside, he navigated service tunnels and utility corridors, avoiding primary thoroughfares where corporate personnel would be present. The environment was sterile, controlled, utterly unlike the chaos of the Scar. Yet in many ways, it was more dangerous. Locating a Lara proved both easier and more disturbing than anticipated. The arcology's internal communication systems, accessible through maintenance terminals, buzzed with excitement over the recovered prototype. Designated holding area, specialized research team, expedited extraction procedures, clinical language masking what Kalen recognized as preparations for vivisection. Time was critical. Kalen moved through the arcology with practiced stealth, using service routes to approach the research wing where a Lara was held. Security increased with each level, forcing him to move more carefully, timing his advances between patrol cycles. The research wing itself was beyond his reach. Biometric scanners, armed guards, and multiple security checkpoints made direct infiltration impossible. But according to the facility schematics he'd accessed, the wing's life support and power systems were routed through an adjacent maintenance hub, a vulnerability if he was willing to exploit it aggressively. Using components scavenged from his equipment and the arcology's own systems, Kalen assembled a crude but effective device, part emergency transponder, part overload inducer. With careful placement in the maintenance hub's primary junction, the device would trigger emergency protocols, forcing an evacuation of non-essential personnel from the research wing. The resulting chaos wouldn't last long, but might create enough confusion for a rescue attempt. It was the nearest thing to a plan he had. Kalen activated the device and retreated to a position near the research wing's emergency evacuation route. The effect was almost immediate. Alarms blared throughout the section. Lights shifted to emergency protocols, and automated announcements directed personnel to designated safety areas. As predicted, the wing's doors opened to allow evacuation. Security personnel maintained position at primary checkpoints, but their attention was divided between evacuees and the unfolding emergency. Kalen observed, waiting for his moment. It came when Alara appeared, escorted by 2 researchers and a security officer. Even from a distance, Kalen could see the difference in her. Her luminescence dimmed to almost nothing, her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. They had sedated her, probably attempting to prevent her from interfacing with the arcology systems. Timing was critical. As the group passed a junction where the main evacuation route intersected with a secondary corridor, Kalen struck. A maintenance panel, loosened earlier, crashed down at the perfect moment, briefly separating the security officer from the others. In the confusion, Kalen emerged from his hiding place, incapacitating the officer with practiced efficiency before the man could raise an alarm. The researchers, unarmed and unprepared for violence, froze in shock. One reached for an emergency communicator, but Kalen was faster, closing the distance and neutralizing both with quick, precise strikes. "Alara," he said, supporting her as she swayed unsteadily. "Can you walk?" Her star-filled eyes struggled to focus on him. "Kalen? How?" "Explain later. We need to move. Now." Supporting most of her weight, he guided her toward a service corridor he'd identified during his infiltration. The sedatives had compromised her coordination, but not her will. Despite her condition, she fought to stay on her feet, to keep moving. "They know what I am now," she managed between labor breaths. "What I can do. They'll never stop hunting us." "Then we'll keep running," Kalen replied, navigating the maintenance passages that would lead them toward a potential escape route, further than they can follow. Their progress was painfully slow. The arcology's layout was labyrinthine, designed to compartmentalize and control. Multiple times they were forced to hide as security teams responded to the emergency, coordinating to identify its source and secure critical areas. Alara's condition complicated matters further. The sedatives affected not just her motor functions, but her unique physiology. The bioluminescent patterns across her skin fluctuated erratically, occasionally flaring bright enough to risk detection. "I can feel this place," she whispered during a moment of lucidity. "Like the facility, but vaster, more complex. If I could interface." "Too dangerous," Kalen cut her off. "You're in no condition, and it would pinpoint our location instantly." They continued their careful advance, working their way toward the arcology's external docking systems. Kalen's plan, such as it was, relied on reaching a maintenance transport, slower than his stolen scout craft, but less likely to trigger immediate pursuit. As they approached the maintenance docking bay, disaster struck. A full security team rounded a corner ahead, immediately spotting the fugitives. Orders were shouted, weapons raised. Kalen shoved Alara into an adjacent corridor, positioning himself to shield her as he assessed their rapidly diminishing options. The security team advanced methodically, their training evident in their coordinated movements. Kalen calculated odds, escape routes, possible weapons. Nothing favorable emerged from his analysis. "Kalen." Alara's voice behind him had changed, the multi-toned quality intensifying. "I need to touch the wall. Just for a moment." He glanced back. Her eyes were clearer now, the sedative's grip weakening as her unique physiology processed the chemicals. The luminescent patterns across her skin pulsed with renewed vigor. "What are you planning?" he asked, keeping his attention divided between her and the approaching threat. "A diversion. Maybe more." Her expression held determination and something else, a confidence he hadn't seen before. "Trust me." The security team was seconds away from having a clear shot. Out of options, Kalen nodded. Alara placed both hands against the corridor wall, her luminescence immediately brightening to painful intensity. The patterns across her skin reorganized, forming more complex configurations than Kalen had previously observed. Through her fingers, the patterns extended into the wall itself, racing along hidden circuitry. The effect was instantaneous and far more dramatic than anything she'd accomplished in the abandoned research facility. Throughout the entire section, systems went haywire. Not just alarms and lights, but fundamental operations. Gravity control fluctuated, sending security personnel stumbling. Atmospheric systems cycled erratically, filling some areas with dense fog. Sealed doors opened and closed in random sequences, creating barriers and passages where none had existed before. Most shocking was the effect on the arcology's defensive drones, which activated in response to perceived threats but seemed unable to distinguish friend from foe. The security team found themselves suddenly defending against their own automated systems, attention completely diverted from the fugitives. Alara pulled her hand away from the wall, staggering slightly. The light in her patterns had dimmed, the effort clearly draining her recovering strength. "This way," she said, pointing down a corridor that had been sealed moments before but now stood open. "The arcology showed me. There's a transport, small, automated. Medical evacuation pod." Kalen didn't question how she knew. Supporting her, he followed her directions through the chaos she'd created. The pod she led them to was indeed small, designed to transport a single critical patient and medical equipment. Its automated systems were already active, responding to the arcology's emergency protocols. "It's programmed to reach the nearest medical facility," Alara explained as they forced the pod's door open. "Outer rings. Away from here." The pod's interior was cramped, meant for a patient on a stretcher rather than two conscious passengers. They wedged themselves in awkwardly, Kalen working to override the automated medical monitoring systems that would have reported their unauthorized use. As the pod's door sealed and the launch sequence initiated, security alarms finally acknowledged their escape attempt. Warning lights flashed as the docking clamps prepared to override the launch, holding the pod in place until security could respond. "They're locking us down," Kalen warned, fingers flying across the pod's limited controls without success. Alara closed her eyes, the luminescent patterns across her skin pulsing once more. Not for long. Throughout the docking area, systems reset simultaneously. The momentary interruption was all their pod needed. It launched, accelerating away from the arcology before the security protocols could re-establish control. They were away, but far from safe. The pod's automated course would take them to another corporate facility, different management perhaps, but no less dangerous for Alara. Manual controls were intentionally limited, designed to prevent patient tampering during transport. "Can you override the destination?" Kalen asked, examining the navigation system. Alara shook her head, exhaustion evident. "Not directly. The safeguards are too complex for a quick interface." She paused, considering. "But I might be able to convince it there's an emergency requiring diversion." "To where?" "The edge. Beyond the corporate territories entirely." Her star-filled eyes met his. "The fringe." The fringe represented the boundary between corporate control and the true unknown. Settlements and outposts operating beyond official oversight, populated by those who rejected both the devastation of the scar and the sterile control of the corporations. Rumors and scattered reports were all most people knew of these communities. They existed deliberately off-grid, protected by distance and obscurity. "Can you do it without alerting the arcology?" Kalen asked. "I think so. This pod's systems are simpler, more isolated." Alara placed her hands on the pod's internal console, her luminescence dimming as she concentrated. "I just need to make it think there's radiation contamination ahead. Create a phantom emergency that requires rerouting." The pod shuddered slightly as its systems processed conflicting information. On the simple display, their course adjusted, veering away from the designated medical facility toward less controlled space. Behind them, the arcology diminished with distance, its imposing bulk reduced to a glittering point against the gradient boundary where the scar's perpetual storms met clearer skies. Both fugitives watched its retreat with similar emotions. Relief mingled with the certainty that this escape was temporary at best. The journey to the fringe took hours, the pod's limited propulsion straining against its programming to maintain their diverted course. Alara spent much of the time in a state of semi-consciousness, the combined effects of the sedatives and her energy expenditure taking their toll. Kalen maintained watch, alert for pursuit or system failures that might strand them in corporate territory. When the pod's automated warnings announced their approach to a settlement, Both were surprised by the absence of any clear infrastructure. No docking towers, no navigation beacons, just scattered lights across a rugged landscape that had escaped both corporate development and the scar's devastation. The pod, confused by the lack of proper landing protocols, initiated its emergency descent procedures. The landing was rough, the small vessel skidding across uneven terrain before coming to rest near a cluster of structures unlike any Kalen had seen before. Not the sterile efficiency of corporate design nor the desperate improvisation of scar survivors, but something organic and intentional. Buildings that worked with their environment rather than imposing upon it. As the pod's door cycled open, letting in air that smelled of unfamiliar vegetation and clean earth, they faced a group of wary locals. Not immediately hostile, but clearly concerned by the corporate medical pod that had invaded their settlement. Kalen exited first, hands visible, body positioned to shield Alara from potential threats. "We need help," he said simply. "We're running from the corporations." One figure stepped forward, an older woman with features that suggested both deliberate genetic modification and adaptation to environmental conditions. Her assessment of Kalen was quick and thorough, the evaluation of someone accustomed to making rapid judgments about strangers. "Most are," she replied, her accent unfamiliar. "Question is, did they follow you here?" "Possibly," Kalen admitted. "We diverted an automated transport. They'll track it eventually." The woman nodded, unsurprised and apparently unperturbed by the potential danger. "Then we should move quickly." Her gaze shifted to the pod's interior, where Alara remained partially visible. "Your friend appears unwell. She needs rest. Somewhere safe." Kalen hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "She's different." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Aren't we all out here?" She gestured to her companions, and Kalen noticed for the first time the diversity among them. Subtle and not-so-subtle modifications, adaptations, and uniquenesses that would have marked them as outsiders in corporate territory. "Bring her. We'll help if we can." The woman turned, leading the way toward the settlement. "I'm Sira. This is Lumen Refuge. Welcome for however long you stay." With Kalen's assistance, Alara emerged from the pod. Her appearance, the luminescent patterns, the star-filled eyes, drew curious glances but no fear or revulsion from the settlers. If anything, there was recognition in some faces, as if her uniqueness resonated with their own. Sarah led them to a small dwelling partially embedded in the hillside, its design utilizing natural features rather than dominating them. Inside was simple but comfortable. Clean bedding, basic furnishings, evidence of sustainable technology that operated without the massive infrastructure of corporate systems. "Rest," Sarah instructed, indicating the space. "Food and water there. Medical supplies if needed. We'll talk more when you're recovered." Left alone, Alara sank onto the bed, her luminescence dimmed to its faintest level. Kalen secured the dwelling, checking exits and potential defensive positions by habit before allowing himself to acknowledge their relative safety. "Do you think we could trust them?" Alara asked, watching him through half-lidded eyes. Kalen considered the question. Trust was a resource he'd parceled out in minuscule portions since the wars, given rarely and withdrawn quickly. "It's something about this place, these people. I think they understand running," he said finally. "Better than most." Alara nodded, accepting his assessment. "The corporations will come eventually. They always do. Then we'll move on when necessary." Kalen settled beside her, his own exhaustion finally making itself known. "For now, we rest. Recover. Plan." She shifted slightly, her hand finding his in the dim light of the dwelling. The luminescent patterns that traced her skin pulsed gently, synchronizing with her heartbeat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming back for me." The simple gratitude struck something deep in Kalen, breaking through layers of emotional scar tissue accumulated through years of isolation and survival. He hesitated, then squeezed her hand gently in acknowledgement. They slept then, two fugitives from different worlds, united by circumstance and choice. Their dreams were different, Alera's filled with fragments of data and sensation from her interface with the arcology's vast systems. Kalen's haunted by echoes of past battles and recent escapes. Yet both rested more peacefully than either had in memory, anchored by the other's presence. Days at Lumen Refuge passed with surprising tranquility. The settlement operated on principles neither had experienced before, collaborative rather than hierarchical, technological but not dependent on massive infrastructure, defensive without being militaristic. Residents possessed a wide range of skills and adaptations, many developed specifically to exist beyond both corporate control and the Scar's poison legacy. Alera's recovery accelerated in this environment, free from sedatives and the stress of constant flight. Her unique physiology stabilized. The luminescent patterns across her skin regained their vigor, pulsing with clear, steady rhythms. More surprising was her reception among the settlers. Rather than fear or scientific curiosity, they showed respectful interest. Several residents with their own technological modifications or unique abilities exchanged knowledge with her, offering perspectives on integration and adaptation she'd never encountered. Kalen found his own place as well, his military and survival skills valued but not exploited. For perhaps the first time since the wars, he was seen as more than a weapon or a tool. The settlement's defensive needs were real. Corporate incursions and autonomous hunter drones occasionally probed the region. But the response was measured, focused on deflection and misdirection rather than direct confrontation. It was during their third week that Sarah finally approached them about the future. They were helping with the settlement's expanded hydroponic system, Alera's ability to interface with environmental controls proving unexpectedly useful for the complex balance the plants required. "You've integrated well," Sarah observed, her manner direct, as always. "Both of you. The question is whether you stay." Kalen and Alera exchanged glances. Neither had articulated their thoughts on permanence, the habit of temporary arrangements too deeply ingrained. "Is that possible?" Alera asked. "The corporations are always a threat," Sarah finished for her. "To everyone here. We manage through community, through sharing resources and knowledge, through movement when necessary." She gestured to the surrounding settlement. "Lumen isn't just this place. It's a network. Communities across the fringe, connected but distributed. When one location becomes compromised, we shift resources, people, knowledge. A survival strategy," Kalen noted with professional appreciation. "A living strategy," Sarah corrected. "Survival is maintaining existence. We aim for more." The conversation might have continued, but alarms sounded from the settlement's perimeter. Not the blaring urgency of imminent attack, but the measured alert of approaching vessels. "Company," Sarah said, unsurprised. Sooner than expected, but not unanticipated. Kalen was already moving, habit taking over as he assessed defensive positions and potential evacuation routes. Alera followed, her luminescence brightening with alarm. "Corporate hunters?" she asked. Sarah checked a communication device embedded in her wrist, another example of the integrated technology the settlers employed. "Unlikely. Pattern suggests independent operators. Mercenaries or bounty hunters. Smaller groups, looking for specific targets rather than general acquisition." "Us," Kalen concluded. "Probably. The pod would have been tracked eventually, even with your interference." Sarah's calm was unshaken. "They'll land outside sensor range, approach on foot. Standard containment protocol. How do you want to handle this?" Kalen asked, automatically deferring to local knowledge. Sarah considered them both, her expression measuring. "Depends on your choice. If you're continuing your journey, we can provide distraction and alternate transport. If you're staying..." Her gaze shifted to Alera. "We have other options." Alera's star-filled eyes met Kalen's, a silent communication passing between them. The past weeks had changed them both, creating a connection neither had anticipated when they first encountered each other in the abandoned research facility. "We'd like to stay," Alera said, the multi-tone quality of her voice resonating with certainty. "If we can contribute, be part of this." Kalen nodded in agreement, surprising himself with how right the decision felt. Sarah's expression warmed slightly. Then let's make these hunters reconsider their contract. What followed wasn't the violent confrontation Kalen had expected from his military days, nor the desperate flight that had characterized their escape from the arcology. Instead, the settlement implemented protocols that spoke of long experience dealing with unwanted attention. Some residents maintained normal activities, creating the appearance of routine. Others activated specialized equipment that generated false energy signatures at the settlement's perimeter, suggesting defenses far beyond what actually existed. A few, including Alara, interfaced with the settlement's limited but sophisticated sensor network, tracking the hunter's approach and feeding them misleading information. Kalen found himself in a strategy session with Sarah and the settlement's defense coordinators. His expertise was welcomed, but adapted to their methods: containment rather than elimination, redirection rather than confrontation. The goal isn't to destroy them, Sarah explained. That just brings more attention, bigger weapons. We want them to report that the trail went cold, that continuing isn't worth the contract. The plan worked with unexpected effectiveness. The bounty hunters, 3 separate groups, Kalen noted with professional assessment, encountered a settlement apparently prepared for much larger threats. Sensor goes suggested automated defenses tracking their movements. Communications experienced targeted interference that separated and confused their coordination. Environmental systems created localized weather phenomena that obscured visibility and hindered equipment. Most effective was Alara's contribution. Working with the settlement's technology specialists, she projected energy signatures matching her unique pattern at multiple locations simultaneously. Pursuit teams split up, following phantoms that led them in circles or into harmless but time-consuming natural obstacles. After hours of increasingly frustrated efforts, the hunters retreated. Their communications, easily intercepted by the settlement's systems, indicated a mission abort. The targets either weren't present or were too well defended to justify the contract's payment. As the vessels departed, residents gathered in the settlement's central area, the atmosphere one of quiet celebration rather than triumphant victory. This was routine for them, another successful defense of their chosen way of life. Sarah found Kalen and Alara at the gathering's edge, both still monitoring sensor readings out of caution. "Your first defense contribution," she noted with approval. "Well executed. They'll send others eventually," Kalen said, the tactician in him unable to ignore future threats. "Of course, and we'll adapt again." Sarah gestured to the celebrating community. "That's the point. Not permanent safety. That's an illusion. But resilience, collective strength, shared knowledge." Alara's luminescence pulsed with something like contentment. "It feels right, being part of something larger." "Speaking of which," Sarah continued, "there's a settlement in the Eastern Network that could particularly benefit from your abilities, Alara. They're developing new interface technologies for environmental remediation, attempting to heal portions of the scar through targeted bioregeneration." The possibility lit Alara's features. Purpose beyond mere survival or exploitation. Could that work? Healing the scar? Unknown, Sarah admitted, but worth attempting. The journey would take several weeks, through territory outside corporate control, but not without dangers. "We've handled worse," Kalen said, surprising himself with the immediate inclusion of himself in Alara's potential journey. Sarah smiled, perhaps the first full expression of warmth they'd seen from her. "I thought you might say that. Transport leaves in 3 days, if you're interested." As she left them to consider the offer, Kalen and Alara moved to a quieter spot at the settlement's edge. Before them stretched the wild landscape of the fringe, untamed but vital, neither the sterile control of corporate territories nor the toxic devastation of Scar. Behind them, the community continued its celebration, voices and laughter creating a backdrop of shared humanity. "Healing the scar," Alara mused, her star-filled eyes reflecting the distant horizon. "Creating rather than just surviving. I never imagined such a possibility." Kalen watched her luminescence pulse with renewed vigor. the patterns across her skin shifting into configurations he now recognized as expressions of hope and possibility. So different from the terrified, defensive posture she'd held when they first met in the abandoned facility. "What do you think?" she asked, turning to him. "Another journey into the unknown?" Kalen considered the question, realized he'd already made his decision. Perhaps had made it the moment he'd returned for her at the arcology. "Together," he said simply. Alara smiled, the expression transforming her otherworldly features into something both alien and intimately familiar. She extended her hand, luminescent patterns flowing across her fingers like living circuitry. Kalen reached out, his scarred, weathered hand meeting her glowing one. The gesture echoed their first interaction, the moment in the abandoned laboratory when he'd offered help instead of harm, when she'd expected death from human hands but received a gentle touch instead. Except now, the touch wasn't surprising or fearful. It was a connection, freely chosen on both sides. A decision to continue. Whatever journey awaited them, facing its uncertainties together. As the settlement's lights dimmed for evening, they remained at its edge, hands joined, watching stars emerge above the fringe's untamed landscape. Neither knew what challenges the future would bring: corporate hunters, environmental dangers, the ongoing process of finding place and purpose in a broken world. But for the first time since the collapse had shattered their respective worlds, both felt something beyond mere survival. Hope, perhaps, or simply the understanding that even in a world of devastation, connection remained possible. That hands capable of violence could also offer gentleness. That beings created for entirely different purposes could choose their own paths forward. Together, they turned back toward the settlement, their temporary home before the next journey began. Tomorrow would bring preparations, plans, practical concerns. But tonight was for possibility, for the simple miracle of two unlikely survivors finding common cause and perhaps something deeper in the ruins of a devastated world. Alara's luminescence cast gentle patterns across the ground as they walked, a soft counterpoint to the settlement's more conventional lighting. The effect was neither entirely human nor completely other, much like Alara herself, much like the future they faced. It was enough. More than either had expected when they first encountered each other in the shadows of the abandoned research facility. More than a mere continuation of existence. It was against all odds and expectations a beginning.